What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detail Comics, where we go over comics in detail. This is Comics Cafe, where I grab my morning coffee and go over a few things with you guys. Just some pretty serious, seriously quick, unedited kind of topics. And what I really wanted to talk about is how do you review a comic book? So for me, comic book reviewing is something that's pretty interesting because it's primarily for me. It's, my thoughts, my perceptions, how I feel about a specific comic book. But there's a difference between how I review a comic book and probably how other people review comic books. So what I mean is, the way that I try to look at everything is, it's comes down to how is this in the story of the individual character? How does the story impact the actual character itself? If it's tied into an overarching event, how does it tie into that particular event? As well as, what is my personal relationship with the character? And I try to, eliminate or enhance individual aspects of those depending on what kind of comic book it is. So if we're talking about, say, like, Batman number 12, right? Batman number 12 was a pretty interesting issue because that's when we had Batman basically declare that he had attempted suicide in his earlier days as a youth before he became Batman, and that he's basically been living on borrowed time ever since. And that was a really interesting kind of concept because, as I'm understanding it, Batman is basically a character that it's owned by pop culture. There's not one specific continuity they can really pull from. There are different indications of personality, but the way that I understand Batman is that every time that you have a new writer, every time that you have a new run on Batman, there's a difference that is going along with this. So while they might maintain the same kind of characters, might be the same kind of timeline, every writer has a different interpretation of Batman. So the way that Scott Snyder writes Batman is going to be distinctly different than the way that Tom King writes Batman versus how James Tynion writes Batman, and so on and so forth. So in the way that Tom King was writing his Batman, I was more forgiving as to what my previously conceived notions of Batman were. Because if it made sense, like in the context of Batman Rebirth and Batman number 1 all the way through to Batman number 12, the revelation of that story made a lot of sense for the portrayal of the character. But then you've got, say, a situation like Spider-Man number 10. Spider-Man number 10 as a tie-in to a specific event, Civil War II, was a failing of that event because the failure was in the event itself. It wasn't necessarily in, what Spider-Man's role was in that event. And if anything, Spider-Man and his portrayal and his retelling of that role to his, intimate friends, that was one of the most powerful parts of that comic book. It's a good comic book, but as an event book, it really failed in kind of developing the plot further of Civil War II, but there wasn't really much to do anyway. It was more of an aftermath. It was more of like this is what's left over kind of situation. But there's different ways to weigh those different merits. And then you've got, say, like a book like Reborn. I just did a review on Reborn number 3. And Reborn, the art style is fantastic. The detail that Greg Capullo puts into his pencils and how the team around that art, that they do a great job on that book. It's fantastic. But the story is failing the art. It's not supporting the kind of structure that it needs. Because if you're talking about logical progressions, it's like the only person with any kind of really detailed backstory was Bonnie, and all her backstory comes from before her death. Like her development of her actual life and how she'd interacted with a few individuals and her relationship with her husband and how he died and all that kind of stuff. And then they're transported into this fantasy land, and there's been almost no development of character, no development of location. There's no sense of scale or scope. They said 10 times larger than Earth. It's just like, well, how in the hell far have Tom and Roy Boy traveled with Bonnie on this hunt for her husband? How many days have elapsed? What's really been going on here? There's no sense of that. There's no perspective. And that's like a frame of reference. Frame of reference is a very good word. Because frame of reference, if you're used to, say, like physics terms, the frame of reference is unique because you frame every kind of equation, every kind of solution in a frame of reference. So if you're talking about, say, you've got one ball that is being thrown in this direction, and then you've got another ball that's being thrown faster in that direction, you have multiple different frames of reference. So the frame of reference could be the stationary person observing those two balls, and you kind of create a solution based on how that person that's stationary perceives those two objects flying. Or you could perceive it from the position of the actual one ball that's flying and then the other one that's flying faster, or the one that's flying faster and you perceive how the other ones are falling behind. So frame of reference is really the most key part in reviewing a comic book, at least for me, because I have to establish where I'm really coming from, or where this book should be coming from in my mind. And when books like that, when they fail or when they don't live up to what they need to be, at least in my perception, that's where I'm coming from. I've set a frame of reference, and I've got an idea as to what would really constitute a good book in this particular sense. If I was looking at Reborn as like a movie that was playing out in front of me and it was taking an hour and a half to go through that actual movie, I would have a completely different perspective, because a lot of these things would move on at a much faster pace. Whereas this is probably going to be something that's going to read a lot cleaner and a lot better in a trade. A collected series of 6 volumes, like the first 6 issues, will probably read really fast, and they'll be fun and they'll be entertaining, but they won't offer the kind of depth that I would expect out of a book that's coming out in a monthly serial. Like Seven to Eternity is a great example of a book that is giving depth and backstory, and it gives you the sensation of lore, because if you're talking about a monthly serial, it's not a film, man. You get instant gratification out of a film. Even a TV show comes out once a week. So you get that kind of carryover and whatnot in that particular story. But in a monthly serial, where you've got these long periods of time in between different parts of the story, there's a lot of development that needs to be had in there. So Seven to Eternity does a great job. They've set up a great world. They've set up a great backstory. There's a sense of a rich lore that you're kind of going into, and that's the difference between, say, something that's written to be, a collected volume, like either in a form of media like a movie or a TV show, or like a graphic novel or a collected trade paperback, something along those lines, or something that's meant to be individual standalone pieces that kind of become a greater part of the whole. So when it comes down to like what I look for or how to review a comic book, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I set a frame of reference, I have an idea of what I'm looking for, and then it's a matter of whether it kind of meets or falls short of what that kind of minimum baseline would really be. And that determines whether I'd recommend it for you guys, because I don't want to recommend something that sucks. Like, if you want my if you want my mindset, when it comes to like the books that I review and things like that, I'm either going to be your friend who's like, oh my god, you've got to check this out. Like, this is why this is good. The art's good. The story's, it's better than average. This is something that you're going to have to read. This is something that you're going to have to check out. Like Descender number 17, and that is a book that more people need to be reading, because it's a great emotionally connected issue. Regardless of what the characters are, you've got a robot dog that makes you feel for the robot dog. You've got a drilling robot that has been basically abused his entire life inside these mines in this small mining colony, and he's got an emotional journey through his own separate issue. It's ridiculous what kind of things go on in Descender, and I would recommend that as my review. Like, that is what I want you to do. I want to share something that's good with you guys, or I want to warn you of something that might not be so good. Like, it's just like, hey, I smelled that. It smells really bad. You shouldn't smell that. That kind of situation. I'm very rarely going to be able to just go out there and bash on a comic book to bash on a comic book, because there's no reason for me to do that. If it's not good, I'm not going to share it with you, unless I feel like it's good, it's poor enough where I wouldn't really recommend it to anybody. So I'm curious as to what you guys do. So like, when you go to a comic book or when you go to a story, what are you picking apart? Like, how do you evaluate those kind of things? Is it an emotional level? Is it on a logical level? How do you kind of connect with the story, or find out how little you connect with the story? So hit me up in the comments, because I want to start that conversation. That's a great place to go, because everybody has a different perspective. Everybody has a different frame of reference. And I'm interested to see where everybody else is coming from. So, like I said, hit me up in the comments down below so we can start that conversation. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows and games, and anything and everything inside the world of comics.